June the 24th, 1947, the Cascade Mountains, Washington State. A private pilot named Kenneth Arnold is flying alone near Mount Rainier when he sees 9 objects moving against the mountains. Fast, in formation, like nothing he can name. He lands. He talks to newsmen. And out of that conversation comes a phrase, flying saucers. Stop the film right there, because this season is not going to relitigate what Kenneth Arnold saw. Honest people have argued about that for nearly 80 years, and that argument belongs to them. What this episode cares about is what the words did. Within 2 weeks, flying saucers were in every newspaper on Earth. And a newspaper in 1947 is not the end of a story's journey. It is the beginning of its second life, as diplomatic traffic. Every embassy in Washington, every consulate in New York, employed people whose job was to read the American press and cable summaries home. The Soviet services ran that operation with industrial seriousness. Their clipping and summary loop is documented in their own archives. And every cable those offices sent left the country through American commercial carriers, where, as we showed you last episode, a program later codenamed Shamrock was quietly photographing everything. So when the saucer story went everywhere, it did not just go into American living rooms. It went, encrypted, into the cable traffic of every government watching America.
Here's the question that started all of this for me. Not what did Arnold see? A code clerk in a Soviet residency doesn't care what Arnold saw either. But the words, Kenneth Arnold, those he has to do something with. A proper name isn't in the code book. It has to be spelled out, letter by letter, through a special table. And a message you're forced to spell is a message that leaks. Now look at the summer of 1947, a season that manufactured strange American names by the thousand, week after week, on every wire in the country. Either that's an accident of culture, or somebody was gardening.
That claim that the summer the modern UFO was born was also a signals intelligence operation is the most audacious claim in this archive. So we are going to handle it with the most care. Every flag spoken out loud, every counter-argument given the floor. And before this hour ends, we will take the strongest version of the idea and break it ourselves. This is the Deception Thread, Episode 3, Gardening. First, the shape of the idea in plain language, because it was published in plain language. In February 2025, James Carrion put the hypothesis into the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence under a title that asks a question, Flying Saucers, an opening salvo of the Cold War. Everything you are about to hear is in that paper and in the working files behind it, including the parts of it the files have since broken. The hypothesis runs like this. Step 1. Seed. Plant stories in the American wire services, or amplify stories already running, dense with anglicized proper names, witness names, employer names. Step 2. Amplify. Let the wires do what wires do. A good saucer story crossed the country in hours. Step 3. The target collects. Soviet intelligence officers in the United States, running their documented press summary loop, cable the material to Moscow, urgent and encrypted. Step 4. Harvest. The cables travel over American commercial carriers. Shamrock copies them, and at Arlington Hall, the codebreakers now hold Soviet ciphertext whose subject matter they planted themselves. They know words that must be inside. In the trade, a known word inside an unread message is called a crib. And staging events to force an enemy to encrypt a crib. Episode 1 taught you the name the codebreakers gave it. Gardening. And there is a real anomaly for the hypothesis to explain. Meredith Gardner, the quiet philologist from Episode 2, rebuilding the KGB's codebook word by word, goes from roughly 15% of that codebook in August 1947 to something like 90% by 1948. That acceleration has genuinely unexplained features. The open histories do not fully account for the curve. A gardening operation would. So would other things. An indicator breakthrough, plain text from an FBI burglary of a Soviet trade office. The honest framing, and the paper's critics made this point, is that gardening would be one possible accelerant among several. Hold that thought. Act 3 will need it.
The mechanism lives or dies on one piece of Soviet tradecraft, the spell table. The codebook had entries for words, for everything else, names, foreign terms. The clerk dropped into a spelling mode, a start marker, the letters, an end marker. The markers were numbers, 7810 to open a spell, 91 to close it. And here's what matters. It works in either alphabet. Transliterate Kenneth into Cyrillic, and you still invoke the table. A cryptanalyst dragging that pattern across intercepted traffic doesn't need to know which alphabet the clerk chose. The name is the crib. The alphabet is a detail.
Now, what would such an operation leave behind in the record? Not a memo. Episode 2 showed you the policy that guaranteed there would be no memo. It would leave artifacts, stories where the names mattered more than the witnesses. On September the 10th, 1947, the Salt Lake Tribune ran a saucer story naming 6 local observers: Galen Caldwell, Richard Anderson, Keith Hughes, Joan Crookston, and a Mr. and Mrs. Fred Thunell. The FBI's Salt Lake City field office went and asked them what they saw. 5 days later, the special agent in charge reported to the director of the FBI. The memorandum survives in the Bureau's own files. Listen to what it says.
Mr. Keith Hughes and Joan Crookston both advised that they were unable to state how their names appeared in the newspaper as having observed flying saucers, inasmuch as neither had ever had the opportunity to view these flying objects, and the newspaper report was erroneous.
2 real people, 2 real names in print attached to a sighting they say they never made. Not, we were misquoted. Not, we'd rather not discuss it. They never saw anything, and they could not explain how their names got into the paper. That memorandum is documented, a primary federal record, and we read it to you verbatim. What it means is not documented. Under the gardening hypothesis, it is exactly the predicted artifact. Name density mattering more than witness truth. Under the mundane hypothesis, it is a reporter padding a story or a prankster feeding real local names to a newsroom on deadline. Now rewind 9 weeks to Phoenix, Arizona, because the Salt Lake names are not the only seeding artifact preserved in the Bureau's own files. July the 7th, 1947. Early evening, an amateur inventor named William Rhodes hears engines over his house, grabs the box camera he kept loaded for family snapshots, and takes 2 photographs of something circling the city. He develops the negatives himself in his home workshop. He talks to local reporters, once, 3 minutes. Within days, he barely recognizes his own quotes, and a Phoenix radio station, KTAR, broadcasts that Army officials are studying his photographs and that the matter is top secret. Rhodes never said that, so he did the one thing no publicity seeker does. He went after his own story, calling the station, tracing the inflated version back toward its source, trying to put it down. What the station finally told him survives in an FBI memorandum from the Phoenix field office, dated September the 4th, 1947. Listen.
He attempted to determine the source of this release, and the radio station finally told him that it was a United press release from Washington, D.C.
A United press release from Washington. Sit with the geography for a moment. The photographs were taken in Phoenix. The witness lived in Phoenix. The radio station stood in Phoenix. But the copy that dressed his pictures in Army interest and a top-secret stamp entered the story at the Washington end of a national wire. And it entered weeks before any federal officer knocked on Rhodes's door. When one finally did, August the 29th, the government wasn't opening a story. It was closing one that Washington copy had already framed as secret. A counterintelligence special agent named George Fugate Jr., on written orders from 4th Air Force Intelligence, arrived with an FBI man in tow and asked to be introduced only as a representative of the United States government. Rhodes handed over what he could find and was told there was little, if any, chance of return. 2 years after that, The Air Force's file closed with a two-word verdict on William Rhodes, publicity seeker, the man who traced his own headlines to Washington, trying to shut them down. Hold on to that verdict. This series will hear it again in other decades, applied to other people. Under the gardening hypothesis, Phoenix is the predicted order of operations, caught on paper. Amplification first, from the center. Collection second, walking into a story already pre-flagged. The trace to Washington is documented, the witness's own contemporaneous account, recorded by a federal agency that wasn't running the collection.
Look at what Phoenix adds that Salt Lake City can't. Hughes and Crookston are names without a witness. Rhodes is a witness fighting his own amplification and losing because the amplification wasn't his. It came down a national wire from Washington, weeks ahead of the government's own collection. A hoaxer inflates his own story. A reporter pads with local names. Neither one explains copy written a couple thousand miles away that pre-stages Army interest and a top-secret stamp before the Army ever knocks. That's the order of operations the hypothesis predicts. Message first, from the center, men second. We keep this case exactly as big as the paper makes it. So, 2 artifacts now, and I'll say the numbers out loud. 2, not 20. I still need the FBI's whole 1947 saucer file cross-referenced against the published names. And I need whoever filed that United Press copy in Washington in July of 1947. A byline, a slug, a desk. Checked against the Air Force intelligence memos, moving toward the FBI that same month. That's what a flag sounds like from the inside. Suggestive, not proven.
Keep the method in view because the rest of this episode is 2 case studies. The 2 loudest stories of that first fortnight. A press release from an atomic bomb group in New Mexico and a P-38 pilot over Montana. Each one examined the way an analyst would. What's documented, what's contested, and what breaks. We start with the most famous press release in American history. Roswell Army Airfield, New Mexico, home of the 509th Bomb Group, and there was no other outfit on Earth like it. The 509th dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was built from scratch inside Manhattan Project secrecy. It flew the aircraft for the Bikini atomic tests in 1946, and in July 1947, it was the only unit in the world capable of delivering a nuclear weapon. For these men, security was not a sideline. It was the core of the job. On July the 8th, 1947, that base told the world it had a flying disc. The release went out through the base public information officer, Lieutenant Walter Haut, a man whose own name the wires promptly garbled into Warren Haut. Base procedure, by the officer's own later account, was that nothing of importance went out without the personal authorization of the commander, Colonel William Blanchard, and a Roswell editor who knew Blanchard said the colonel confirmed he had authorized this one. So the first finding, and we flag it as documented, the announcement was a deliberate, command-approved act. The rogue lieutenant theory is retired. 2 rival wire services carried it, and they did not say the same thing. Here is the Associated Press.
The Army Air Force here today announced a flying disc had been found on a ranch near Roswell and is in Army possession. Lieutenant Warren Haut announced the find had been made sometime last week and had been turned over to the airfield through cooperation of the Sheriff's Office. It was inspected at the Roswell Army Airfield and subsequently loaned by Major Jesse A. Marcel to higher headquarters.
And here is United Press. Listen for what's different.
Possession of a flying disc was disclosed today by the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group. Officers at the base say that the disc was flown in a super fortress to higher headquarters, undisclosed. The airbase refused to give details of construction. Residents near the ranch reported seeing a strange blue light several days ago, about 3 a.m.
Loaned versus flown in a superfortress. No blue light versus a strange blue light at 3 in the morning. For decades, that mismatch has been read as the fingerprint of two scripts, handed out on purpose, including, we should say plainly, by earlier revisions of this very archive. And then there is the clock. The Associated Press's own minute-by-minute wire log for July the 8th survives, reprinted the next day by a college newspaper. First bulletin, about 4:36 in the afternoon, a disc has been found. 4:40, the officer named. 4:55, the location, sent at high priority. 5:53, the story starts being canceled. A Washington bulletin about General Ramey and right field replaces it. And at 7:29, the kill. A Fort Worth weather officer calls it a weather balloon. From "we have a flying disc" to "it was a weather balloon" in about 3 hours, with the replacement bulletins already lined up. That is what a managed walkback looks like. We flag the prearranged reading as contested, documented down to the minute, and still short of proof of purpose.
Put yourself on the receiving end, in a Soviet residency. Anything touching the 509th goes to Moscow on the same day with high priority. That unit sat at the absolute top of the Soviet target list. A sensational announcement, and then a retraction 3 hours later. That's 2 rounds of urgent encrypted cable traffic from a single event. If you were farming cipher, Roswell is the best seedbed in North America. A deliberate command-authorized announcement, documented. A walkback so fast it looks rehearsed, contested. And one detail that won't sit down.
The blue light. It appears in the UP copy from the first minute, and never in AP. The AP's own wire log has no blue light anywhere in the feed. A detail aimed at one channel is exactly what a planted detail would look like. One deliberate announcement, 1 3-hour walkback, 0 proof of purpose. To get closer than that, we need a case where we can see the seams of the wire services themselves. We need to go to Montana, 2 days earlier. Sunday, July the 6th, 1947, Bozeman, Montana. A story moves on the United Press wire. A local survey pilot named Vernon Baird, flying for the Fairchild Photogrammetric Engineers Company, says his P-38 tangled with a formation of strange objects, pearl gray, clam-shaped, with a plastic dome. One headline called it the flying yo-yo, and that he knocked one of them down. His photographer, George Sutton, along for the ride. The same day, the Associated Press moved the same story. Except in the AP version, the pilot is Casey Baird, a P-38 pursuit pilot working for the United States Geodetic Survey. Count the versions because the wires could not agree on who this man was. United Press, Vernon Baird, Fairchild Photogrammetric Engineers Company. Associated Press, Casey Baird, United States Geodetic Survey. International News Service, Vernon Baird again. But now his aircraft is a P-3 in the lead paragraph, and his boss is A.J. Archer of the Fairchild Aerial Surveys. The Portland Oregonian, Russell Baird. Across the services, 8 distinct variants, 3 first names, 3 employers, 3 different middle initials for the boss in Los Angeles, 2 aircraft, 2 diameters for the object, 3 altitudes. And on July the 7th, the St. Louis Star and Times printed the UP version and the AP version on page 1, side by side, with neither editor noticing that the 2 stories described the same man. So who was he? The answer sits in the Montana papers of the year before, and it is documented. June 1946, 3 separate articles, Helena, Butte, Billings, describe Vernon Baird Jr., a real Lockheed P-38 pilot, employed by Fairchild Aerial Surveys, Incorporated of Los Angeles, under contract to the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, photographing 4,200 square miles of Wyoming and Montana from as high as 34,000 feet, with cameraman George William Steuffen, a former Army Air Forces bombardier navigator. Vernon Baird was real. Casey Baird was not. No such person appears anywhere in the record. Neither does Russell. And the United States Geodetic Survey is not the precise name of any federal agency that existed. The AP was wrong on the man's name and wrong on his employer, two independent facts, while UP was right on both. Casey is not a slip of the pen for Vernon. A federal agency is not a misreading of a Los Angeles company. The two wires were sourcing from different places. And now the episode does the hardest thing in it. Everything you have heard tonight, the names, the wires, the cables, assumes the harvest was possible, that the Soviet cables Shamrock photographed in the summer of 1947 could actually be read. Episode 2 taught you the machinery, the one-time pad, unbreakable when used properly, the wartime printing error that duplicated pages, depth, the entanglement that opens only when a page is used twice. Here are the numbers from the declassified record. Of the KGB's 1944 traffic, roughly half would eventually be read. Of 1945's, about 1.5%. Of 1946 and 1947, effectively none. The duplicated pages were a 1942 production run, almost entirely consumed by the war's end. By the summer of the saucers, the Soviets' fresh pads were clean, and a crib, any crib, however perfectly planted, cannot read a message on a clean pad. Not hard to read. Impossible. The codebreakers themselves did not know that yet. The National Security Agency's own internal history preserves both the hope and its collapse. In 2 sentences, its analysts, it records, had
undoubtedly expected to eventually read current traffic, with the older traffic providing the clues. In fact, it would be the other way around.
So say the flag and say it plainly. The strongest form of the gardening hypothesis, plant names in the June 1947 press, read them that summer in Soviet cipher, is refuted, not contested. Refuted on cryptologic grounds in this archive's own scorecard. The depth the technique requires had collapsed before the operation would have begun. But watch closely what the refutation kills and what it leaves alive, because this is how you hold a big idea honestly instead of letting it hold you. It does not kill the attempt. A planner in 1946, watching Gardner begin to open the old traffic, could rationally have believed current cables were next. The hope was real. You just heard it read from NSA's own history. An operation launched on that belief was coherent when launched, and futile in a way its authors could not have known. Sweden in 1946, while a thin tail of duplicated pads still lived, and a second season in 1947, run after the window had closed. That version, the operation as a misfire, survives, flagged as a hypothesis. And it does not kill the quieter harvest. You do not need to read a cable to learn from it. Which circuits light up, which residencies report, how fast, how much, in reply to what. Traffic analysis needs no depth and no cribs, only a stimulus you control and a tap you own. The press supplied the stimulus, Shamrock supplied the tap. As a traffic analysis operation, 1947 is cryptologically coherent from end to end. That is the surviving form. Its flag is hypothesis, and it stays live. One last thread from that week, left where later episodes can reach it. The same Oregonian article that renamed the Bozeman pilot a third time also reached, by telephone, the chief of the Air Materiel Command, Major General Nathan Twining, at Kirtland Field, New Mexico, in the very week of the Roswell debris. On the record, 24 days before the memorandum that founded the Air Force's official saucer study, Twining said,
"Some of these witnesses evidently saw something, but we don't know what. We are investigating."
Remember where he was standing. This series will come back to Kirtland, 33 years later, to watch the same base's counterintelligence office take a private citizen apart.
I published the strong form of this hypothesis in a peer-reviewed intelligence journal, and I'll tell you exactly where it stands tonight. The mechanism. Sound. Built entirely from documented parts. The seeding artifacts, real and still unexplained. Hughes and Crookston never saw anything. Casey Baird never existed. And William Rhodes's top secret headline was written in Washington by somebody who wasn't him. The Harvest, in its boldest form, refuted by the depth wall. I accept that. What's left is narrower. A traffic analysis operation or a crib operation launched in good faith against a window that had already shut. Narrower and harder to kill. And there are tests. Count how often American names survive spelled out in the released Venona translations. Check the translations dated within a week of Arnold, of Roswell, of Bozeman. Pull the October 1946 Russian Systems Survey from the NSA archives, the one document that would show whether anyone believed current diplomatic traffic was exploitable. Pull the AP slug. Find the UP Washington filer behind the Rhodes release. A hypothesis you can kill with a file pull isn't a faith. It's a lead.
The lesson of this episode is not about 1947. It is about how to hold a big idea. Seed, amplify, manage, harvest. The summer of 1947 shows you a seeding pattern nobody has explained, an amplification system working at full industrial roar, and a management performance, 3 hours, the Roswell press release, the announcement to kill, that still reads like choreography. What it cannot show you, because the mathematics forbids it, is the harvest as first imagined. The show found the wall and said so out loud. That is the whole method. A thread is only worth following if you are willing to cut it yourself. So, one more time, who benefits? If the narrow forms hold, the beneficiary was whoever was mapping Soviet nerves that summer. Which circuits, which residencies, how fast? If the mundane explanations hold, the beneficiaries were the newspapers, who sold a very good July. The honest ledger, the seeding is open and now carrying 2 artifacts. The amplification is documented, the management is contested, the harvest is refuted in the grand form, but is alive in the narrow one. Next time, on the deception thread. While the saucer wave crested, 2 men in Tacoma, Washington were telling a magazine editor a story about slag that fell from the sky, a story its own teller would admit he made up. It didn't matter. On the 1st of August, 1947, at 2:30 in the morning, a B-25 came apart in the air near Kelso, Washington. 2 Army intelligence officers were dead. In their cargo, fragments from that flying saucer case. Deception is not a parlor game. This one had a body count, and it was no hypothesis. Episode 4, Maury Island.
Thank you for taking the time to listen. Remember, we don't teach you what to believe, we teach you how to think. This is the Circle Jerk.